So Python Crash Course has a exhaustive chapter on classes. I think it just goes on and on and on, describing different ways of making classes. It's exhaustive, which means that it's beyond comprehensive. I think this particular chapter could be restructured to make it easier to understand classes. Nonetheless, it is exhaustive. Towards the end here, he talks about, so it just keeps on going. Towards the end or somewhere along here, can't remember who it is, finding your own workflow. I would have put this section here right up at the beginning in the first couple of pages, or the first page of this chapter 9, because as you can see, Python gives you many options for how to structure code in a large project. It's important to know all these possibilities so you can determine the best ways to organize your projects. When you're starting out, keep your code structure simple. Try doing everything in one file. If you like how modules and files interact, try storing your classes in modules when you start a project. Find an approach that lets you write code that works and go from there, right? It's not as though you have to know all these different ways. You just have to know they exist, right? And pick a way that you're familiar with and that you like to do. You know, depending on, and then from there, if you start getting into projects, or when you start getting into projects and stuff, then just look it up how to structure your code in different ways. As long as you know one or two ways how to import a module and all that stuff, and that, then you're fine, right? So anyway, I just wanted to make that comment because I think that's a chapter that could be restructured and improved. So and there's a few things with that chapter as well that are annoying. Some of the words he uses repeat themselves. I can't really remember where they are. Where are they? Like this. I think it's this one here. It's just too exhaustive. Some of the parameters match the. See here, they match the attributes. Make, model, year. Make, model, year. It would have been good if he had made. There's lots of examples of this in this chapter where he duplicates parameters and attributes, and it would have been worth making them different so that a learner can see how they tie in, because you can make some of these different and it won't make a difference. Anyway, so that's the end of that. So I just want to now talk about what I've learned with classes. So yeah, classes are a way. Well, modules are a way to structure your code. I'm going to talk about classes now. So here's a class. I've called the class user. Here in the doc string, we write what the class does. The first part of any class is to write a method. It's important not to confuse methods with modules. They're two different things. So a function, here are functions. These are all functions. Right, so you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You got 5 functions in this class. But when you put a function in a class, you stop calling it a class and you start calling it a method. So we stop calling them functions, even though they behave like functions, and we start calling them methods. Why? Because that's the convention that lets people know that if you use the word method, it belongs to a class. Whereas if I use the word function, it will just be a function. If I use the word method, even though it behaves like a function, saying method will tell somebody else like you that this method is part of a bigger class. The first part of any class is to write the first method, and the first method needs to be an initialize init method, and then the parameters of that method. The first one needs to be self, and the reason it needs to be self is so that when we write these are called attributes here. So self.firstname equals firstname.title, that's an attribute. Another attribute is self.lastname equals lastname.title, that's another attribute. These are all attributes. The reason we use self is so that the methods that we write after the first method, or if you don't even write any other method, if you just write, if you just start printing things and using things, it will point back then to here and here by putting self in first. So it helps the code that we write later point back to here, to the initialization method. That's why that's one of the reasons we write self. And self needs to be in front of everything. See, it's in front of absolutely everything here. So it's pointing back to the initialization method. And all this, remember, all that there is a method, and all this here is a method. Methods behave the same as functions. They just get called methods because they're in classes. So after you write self, with the first method always needs to be initialization method. Then we put in self, and then we continue with the parameters. Now, then after you do that, we write a docstring. Like what does this initialization method do? So in this instance, we just initialize the user, So now notice here that first name links in with first name. Now this could be a different name, so that you can change these around, but in this book, Python Crash Course, he doesn't bother changing them around, he keeps them the same. But you can change some of these names. I think it's this one actually, you can change. As long as this one's the same as long as that first name is the same as this first name, you're right. But you can change this to something else, like, if you wanted to. So yeah, the first thing is to write these. These are called attributes. Now, these match up, right? That one there matches up with that one. Email matches up with that one. But notice how login attempts down here, there is no parameter up here. You can do that. You don't have to have a parameter up here. You can have your own attribute that's linked into another method, like down here. So it means that you don't have to enter these parameters in order to initialize a class. So down here in line 59, that's initializing the class. One needs to, so here's the actual initialization of the there's a number of classes in this. There's 3 classes. One class called user, another class called admin, another one called privileges. But that one here is the initialization. So you write the class, and then you have to enter the parameters, and then you have to point that object to something. In this case, I've pointed it towards Eric, And then after I've initialized the class, right, I can then start calling the methods. So I'll just finish up now and say that here's one class, user, here's another class, admin, and here's another class called privileges. And this here is the initialization line, and then I'm calling different things now. Once I initialize a class and point it towards, and then that becomes an object, and point that towards and label it Eric, then I can use Eric, and then start through dot notation. I can then start to run or call methods that are within the class. So Eric describe user, right? There is no describe user underneath this class. Describe users should be here, So you can actually use the methods in other classes. Okay, so this class here, admin user, it needs first name, last name, username, email, and location. So I've got first name, last name, username, email, location. Point it towards Eric, and once I've initialized Eric, I can then, through dot notation, I can then use any of the other methods, even if they're not underneath the admin class. For example, dot describe user is not underneath the admin class. It is underneath the user class. I can do that. As you can see here, I've done that there. In the second one, I've said Eric, which I've already set up the top here in the initialization line. I've then pointed towards privileges, self.privileges, right? So privileges here, right? And then I've put down dot show privileges, right? So describe use, greet user, increment, reset user, show privileges. Here's here. Show privileges is there. So that might not teach you anything. That doesn't let you know how to do this. It just points out some things that you may or may not know, or summarizes some things. So I hope that helps.